Up next, a young girl sees her mother's killer but can't identify him.
There was nothing. She was a complete blank.
With no other evidence, the case turns cold.
After Kathy was laid to rest, I was always struggling, trying to find out who could have done this.
Until forensic scientists decided to play act the crime.
Basically what we were doing was we were strangling each other.
And when they did, found evidence hidden for 15 years.
It takes science and luck to solve cases. In this case, it took a lot of luck.
Mike Odom met Kathy Martin in high school. They dated and soon decided to make a life together. But before they could get married, Mike was arrested for selling heroin, a mistake that put him behind bars for 2 years.
I remember while he was in the penitentiary, and Kathy was dead set on waiting on him to get out to date him again, which she did.
Shortly after his release, Mike and Kathy did get married and had 2 children, Tasha and Sean. Kathy's father even gave Mike a job working in his sign business.
Kathy was set on making the marriage work, did everything she could.
Things were going well until one night when Mike couldn't get in touch with Kathy, who said she'd be home with the 2 children. Kathy didn't answer the phone, so Mike called his next-door neighbor and asked him to see if anything was wrong.
The neighbor went over, beat on the door, nobody answered. He looked in, and I think the TV was going. There was just something suspicious.
But instead of calling police, the neighbor drove a quarter-mile into town, found a policeman, and they both went back to the Odoms' house together. The officer entered the unlocked house. Inside, on the living room sofa, was 4-year-old Tasha, beaten and unconscious, but still alive. He found 2-month-old Sean unharmed in the back room. In the next room, he found Kathy Odom on the floor, naked and covered in blood. She'd been stabbed to death. An ambulance rushed 4-year-old Tasha to the hospital. When Kathy's father arrived at the scene, police told him little about what had happened.
I said, "Where's the children?" He said, "Well, the children have been taken to the hospital." And he said, "That would be a good place for you to go and check on the children."
Frank described to me what it was like to be sitting in the hospital, and he looked up at a TV set, and that's when he learned that his daughter had been killed.
I didn't know that at the time, and I seen that. Well, I went outside the hospital and sat down, cried a long time, until I got myself back together a little bit to, I never did go back to the house that night, which was strange.
When Mike Odom got there, police paid special attention to his appearance.
Mike Odom, the husband, drives up, and he's wearing blue jeans and a blue shirt, and one of the investigators notices that he's got stains on his shirt. Is that blood? Is it not blood?
A search of the Odoms' home revealed blood in the bathroom, which meant the killer had cleaned up before leaving. But police found no evidence of a break-in. All the doors were locked except the front door. This indicated Kathy probably knew her killer. Kathy Odom's autopsy showed she had been stabbed 19 times and sexually assaulted.
This is a crime of passion, that it's not a stranger killing, because why would a stranger feel the need to stab her 16 times plus slash her throat 3 more times?
Kathy Odom's clothes told police something about what happened.
She took them off, she folded them up deliberately. You know, her clothes haven't been ripped off of her, so she voluntarily took her clothes off.
Police believe that the killer attacked Kathy Odom's daughter, Tasha, in order to make Kathy do whatever he wanted.
Number one, it would make Tasha stop crying. And more importantly, it would convince Kathy that he's serious and she better go along with what he's going to do.
Apparently, the killer used a cord from a nearby lamp and bound Kathy's wrists before sexually assaulting her, then stabbing her to death.
In the end, she ended up losing her life while she was protecting herself and her children.
As family members tried to cope with Kathy's murder, they prayed for 4-year-old Tasha's recovery.
They had Tasha on IVs. She was in a coma state. She had been beaten bad.
As doctors worked on the little girl, police talked to her father, Mike.
His emotions, he was emotional, he was distraught, but there were some people that at the scene that thought, well, we need to look at this person a little bit more.
Also suspicious, Mike Odom didn't come straight home after work on the night Kathy was murdered. Instead, he went out with friends. That's why he was calling his wife that night to let her know he'd be late.
We've seen it before where an individual has arranged a murder. He's at another location. He calls the person, go check on my wife. So we're always suspicious of the husband until we can get him cleared out.
When police interviewed Mike Odom, they saw stains on his shirt, which was taken to the forensic lab for testing. Police also found suspicious stains on the floor mats of Tim Robinson's car, the neighbor who first contacted police.
We had to get the floor mat. We had to send it to the lab and have it tested.
The medical examiner estimated that Kathy Odom was murdered about 6 hours before her body was found, which would have been about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Mike Odom and his neighbor Tim Robinson both claimed to be at work at the time. While investigators checked their alibis, they got a potential witness. Tasha Odom emerged from her coma and told investigators she remembered a man entering the house and coming up to her.
What Tasha could remember was that the person put their hands up over their face. And so that tells you right there, they knew Tasha. She said, he had yellow hair like you, Nanny. Your hair yellow.
Mike Odom didn't have blonde hair, and neither did Tim Robinson. But the killer's hair color was all Tasha could remember.
There was nothing. She was a complete blank. She remembered nothing.
When the forensic tests came back, the stains in Tim Robinson's car turned out to be motor oil. The stains on Mike Odom's shirt were paint. In addition, co-workers provided solid alibis for both of them, and they each passed polygraphs.
If they don't have anything to do with it, then we want to get them cleared out as quickly as possible so we can move on to the next person.
And that next person was mentioned by everyone who knew Kathy. It was her brother-in-law, Greg Marquardt.
Everyone knew their relationship and that it wasn't good, that he had this weird obsession for her, that she didn't like him, that she was afraid of him, and that he had tried to make advances toward her before, to put a move on her before, and she didn't like it.
And there was ample evidence Greg had been in the house.
They found his fingerprints, his hair throughout the scene.
There was only one problem. As a family member who'd been in the house numerous times, this didn't prove a thing. The only witness to Kathy Odom's murder, her 4-year-old daughter Tasha, had sustained a massive blow to her head.
She had injuries to her face with swelling and everything, and it would appear that she was hit, with a fist.
But after 2 days in a coma, Tasha rallied. Before her release from the hospital, her uncle, Greg Marquardt, came to visit. It was an encounter Tasha's grandmother would never forget.
Hey, Tasha, how are you feeling?
Hi, Greg.
How's she doing?
Better.
I brought you this.
Tasha, when she saw Greg, she looked over at me like scared to death. Look.
When they asked little Tasha whether it was her uncle Greg who entered the house on the day of the attack, she said she couldn't remember.
They tried different things to try to bring out those memories. At one point, they even hypnotized her, hoping they could find some grain of memory.
She was so traumatized, she never recalled it.
35-year-old Greg Marquardt had been married to Kathy Odom's sister, Shelley, for 4 years. Shelley and Greg had served time in prison for possession of cocaine.
It's the drug scene of the 80s they were caught up in.
In fact, one of the reasons Kathy wanted to move to a new house was to get away from Greg, who had made many sexual advances toward her.
She was scared of Greg. She said, I would not want to be alone with him by myself.
Oddly, despite these rebuffs, Greg Marquardt was surprisingly open about his attraction to Kathy, particularly to one part of her body.
He had a thing for Kathy's tummy, which is sort of odd. I mean, why would he pay attention to her tummy and be obsessed by that?
This fixation was so obvious, Kathy talked about it with friends.
Kathy even would say, I don't know what it is, but he's just, there's something about my stomach that, and he wants to have sex with me.
I've heard of people having fetishes with feet or hands, but that's the first one having a fetish with a stomach that I've heard of.
Coincidentally, Kathy Odom had been stabbed repeatedly in the stomach.
And these are deep, penetrating wounds.
When questioned by police, Marquardt denied any involvement, but said little else.
At some point in that detective's interview, Greg said, excuse me, I need to go out and put money into the parking meter. He got up, he left, he never came back.
Greg's wife, Shelley, the victim's sister, said Greg drove her to school at 10:30 on the day of the murder and picked her up again at 2:30. This 4-hour window was more than enough time for Greg to commit the murder and clean up before picking up his wife from school.
The way I would describe Shelley is she's extremely codependent and absolutely was under the control of Greg Marquardt. This much I know, that he got her hooked on heroin, which to me is the worst thing that a human being could do to another one.
An analysis of the crime scene provided little help. Greg's fingerprints and hairs were found in Kathy's house, but other family members' prints were found there as well.
He was her brother-in-law, and he had been to the house before, so it was natural that you would find his fingerprints and his hairs.
Although Kathy had been sexually assaulted, this crime occurred years before DNA was widely used in murder investigations.
At the time, in the 1980s, they were using serology. Basically, they were doing blood group typing, and it was very difficult. You need a very large sample, and plus, you would only get a blood type.
The blood type from the rape kit was consistent with Greg Marquardt's blood type.
He was a type O. About 50% of the population is a type O, so that's not giving you much information.
So, without more evidence, the case went cold.
After Kathy was laid to rest and time went on, I found myself at the cemetery most all the time, but I was always struggling, trying to find out who could have done this.
They say if you don't solve the crime within a month with all the fresh leads, that's not a possibility there that you would.
Greg and Shelley Marquardt went on with their lives, but for Kathy's father, it was especially difficult.
The idea that he had to go through his daughter's murder and then live believing for all those years with all his heart that the man who did it was married to his other daughter. Can you imagine what that would be like?
It took 11 years before DNA testing became dependable enough to generate a DNA profile from the biological evidence in Kathy Odom's rape kit. When that profile was compared to Greg Marquardt's DNA, it wasn't 100% conclusive, but it did show that Greg was among the 2% of the general population who could have been the perpetrator.
Well, when this came forward, I thought, sure, we had him.
But Greg had an explanation. He claimed he and Kathy were having a consensual affair and was with her on the morning of her murder, but he insisted she was alive when he left.
Greg Marquardt was not arrested at that time because the district attorney we were talking to did not feel like we could get a conviction on this case with him saying, at that time I was having an affair with her, that we were having consensual sex.
They would have to prove that Greg was there that day and that Greg was there to murder Kathy.
But how would they do it? It had been 4 years since DNA testing showed that Greg Marquardt was among the 2% of the general population who could have sexually assaulted and presumably murdered Kathy Odom. But investigators weren't sure how to counter Greg's claim that he was involved in a consensual affair with Kathy around the time of her murder. While this was taking place, investigators were working with Catherine Long at Orchid Cellmark, a private forensic lab in Dallas.
Catherine Long, her dad, was the chief of police in El Paso, Texas. So she thinks a little differently than your normal scientist.
And Cellmark was doing some unusual experiments at the time.
Basically what we were doing was we were strangling each other.
Not for fun, it was business to determine whether a killer would deposit skin cells in the act of choking a victim.
We would swab their neck. We would also swab the hands of the person who had performed the choking.
That's when they realized there was a significant transfer of skin cells.
And it was actually very high.
Investigators needed to find something in Kathy's evidence file that would have contained the perpetrator's skin cells. The answer was the electrical cord used to bind Kathy's hands.
Anytime you go anywhere, you leave a piece of yourself behind, be it skin cells, be it a hair follicle, be it a fingerprint.
In an incredible piece of luck, the cord had been stored not in a plastic bag, but a paper bag.
That paper bag provides breathability so that if there is any moisture on that item, it's going to dry, and that will therefore prolong the DNA life. It will actually preserve the DNA longer than it would in a plastic bag.
The cord was covered in blood, so scientists swabbed the cord for the blood and any skin cells that existed with the blood. Testing revealed 2 genetic profiles. One was Kathy Odom's DNA. The other was Greg Marquardt's. The only way Marquardt's DNA would have been on the bloody electrical cord found wrapped around Kathy's hands was if he were the killer. Greg Marquardt was arrested and charged with Kathy Odom's murder. In prison, Marquardt told the whole chilling story to a fellow inmate. Marquardt said he was high on heroin when he drove to Kathy's house that day. Once inside, he made a sexual advance, which she rejected.
You need
to stop.
You're gonna tell me that.
You need to stop.
You say we don't feel.
Get out of here, Craig.
To force her to comply, he struck his 4-year-old niece Tasha repeatedly in the head, leaving her for dead. The baby, Sean, was in the next room. And Greg threatened to kill him too. In order to save the baby's life, Kathy complied. Using a knife from the kitchen, Greg cut the electrical cord from a lamp and bound Kathy's wrist, leaving his DNA on the cord. After he sexually assaulted Kathy, he stabbed her to death. He washed up in the bathroom and changed into Kathy's husband's clothing to keep blood out of his car. Little did Marquardt know, advances in science would be able to identify him as the perpetrator 15 years later.
Sweet. Thank you, God. Justice. God knows what we're going to have in 10 years or 20 years. It's even better and more advanced than what we have now. It's amazing.
When faced with this evidence, Greg Marquardt pled guilty to Kathy's murder and was sentenced to 45 years in prison. He died of liver disease after serving 4 years of his sentence. He was 56 years old.
Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. That's the way I feel about it.
Doesn't bring back Kathy. I'll always remember her. The house she put together, the things we did. It's tough to lose a child, but I thank the good Lord for everything he did.
It's just one of those cases that, I guess it makes you proud to be a part of, that we were able to have a good ending to it, and that's just filing on him. That Greg was not able to get away with murder in this case, but there's a lot more out there that are still unsolved.